Hey, TikTok, you know how they're talking about all this deportation now and naturalization and all of that sort of a thing? When I was growing up, we used to want, and I grew up in a big city, and we used to always wonder, black person can't get $50 from the bank to go across the street, but there's a liquor store on every corner owned by a Korean. There's a nail shop on every corner owned by an Asian, and what's not owned by them are owned by Indians. And then we get the food from the Mexicans, and we're wondering, like, where are they getting this money that we can't get? But you know what it is? Is the government is giving them money to make money so that they can tax them. But the government always has the ability to take their United States status away. So that's why they give them the money. We'll give you the money, you'll make money, we'll tax you, but you're going to be good. Because if you act up, we're going to kick you out. They can't do that to us because this is home. They give us that money, we can do what the hell we want. They can't kick us out. So for them, give the money to the foreigner, let them make as much money as they can, we'll tax them, and if they choose to show their ass, we will deport them.
Yes, this is really important. Asian Americans were redlined from opening businesses in white neighborhoods because white people didn't want Asian Americans operating in their neighborhoods and didn't want Asian Americans profiting off of white people. But because the positionality of Asian Americans is weaponized to oppress black people, Asian Americans were being given loans to open businesses in black communities, even though black people were not able to receive loans to open businesses in their own communities. And as I've said before, as a result of this, black wealth is essentially paid out twice when it goes to Asian American businesses. Once when the individual pays for the goods or services, and then again when the Asian American business owner removes the profit from the community. Because usually people open businesses in their own communities, and this is mutually beneficial, where the business owner is making a livelihood off of providing goods and services to their community, and by being a member of the community, they're contributing and they're investing back into the community. This is an ideal situation, and that is not what happens with Asian American businesses operating in black communities. Asian American businesses have been operating in black communities for 60 years. I'll say it again. The Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, and the United States opened the door to Asian immigration in 1965 to put immigrants in the way of black people. And this idea that the tension between business owners and customers is one of mutual cultural misunderstanding that could be overcome if they just got to know each other better, the time for that has long passed. And as I've said before, the problem with framing the misunderstanding as mutual is where one demographic owns the businesses and the other demographic has to pay. There's no mutuality. There is a power imbalance. The only situation that I could see being beneficial at this point would require Asian Americans to be willing to leverage their ability to secure the business loans, to secure supplier accounts, and to attain business licenses, to open in black communities specifically to hire black people to work in the businesses and to provide the professional development opportunities so that black people can become the leadership in the businesses in their communities. But I don't have a lot of hope that Asian Americans are willing to do that because the Asian American business owners that we see currently are not even willing to treat their black customers as human. So I fully support black people boycotting these problematic businesses in their community. And I want to say that I think another thing that non-black people aren't aware of is that it is not as simple as boycotting the businesses and putting them out of business and then opening your own to compete. Because the system will find ways to still not give them the loans or rezone them so they can't open a business or not grant the business licenses. And suppliers are literally conspiring against black people who have managed to open a business in their own community to not supply to them because they don't want black people competing with the Asian American owned businesses in the community. So I wish that I had more to offer in the way of solutions, but I really don't. But please do not gaslight black people with respect to what the issue is. Since you ask, black people in the United States on average were more successful than Asian Americans up until the 1950s and 60s when the United States started pushing the model minority myth. If you look at census data from the 1940s, black people were earning significantly more than Asian people. But the United States was engaging in military actions in Asia under the guise of bringing democracy and fighting against communism when the rest of the world started to wonder, with the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and Jim Crow, what business did the United States have being in another continent telling other countries how to operate when they treat their own people so poorly? That's when the United States started to say, no, Asians are doing great. They work hard, they're quiet, they don't protest, and they are lifting themselves up by their bootstraps out of poverty. The problem is black people who are protesting. And opportunities that were previously withheld from both black and Asian people started being provided to Asian people and continued to be withheld from black people. Then in 1964, when the Civil Rights Amendment finally passed and black people were supposed to receive equitable access to those opportunities, in 1965, the United States opened the door to Asian immigration with the Hart-Celler Act and continued giving those opportunities to Asian people. Very importantly, the ability and resources to open, own, and operate businesses in black neighborhoods, which effectively deprived black people of the ability to invest in their own neighborhoods. Now, in case you're still thinking, no, it really is about emphasis on education, by the 1980s, an Asian American without a high school diploma was earning about the same as a white person without a high school diploma, and both were earning significantly more than a black person without a high school diploma. So that has nothing to do with educational attainment and everything to do with the opportunities provided. But also that you inserted yourself in a conversation between two Asian Americans to weaponize Asian American identity against black people is just gross. Okay, so part 2 because part 1 got interrupted by an earthquake. The last set of United States Census data taken before the Civil War shows that there were an estimated 4 million enslaved Africans and black Americans in the United States. Cumulative data shows that from 1619 until 1860, there were 10 million enslaved Africans and black Americans in the United States who contributed an estimated 410 billion hours of labor, with a significant amount of that growth occurring from 1820 until the Civil War. So let's be clear here, the practice was not limited in scope. At the time of the Civil War, nearly 1/3 of Confederate households were directly participating in the enslavement of 4 million Africans and black Americans. So you are making the claim that it was of no economic benefit to the United States because you don't want to acknowledge anything that detracts from your belief that it was white Americans solely who grew the United States economy, and you definitely don't want to acknowledge the financial basis for reparations. But the thing is, if you don't acknowledge the economic contribution of those 410 billion hours of enslaved labor, what you are left with is having to acknowledge that for 200 plus years, the United States engaged in the enslavement of 10 million people and fought a bloody war with itself to defend the right to own human beings as property and to brutalize them simply because they enjoyed doing so. So whether you recognize it or not, you are making the argument for reparations. While it is true that prior to redlining, a lot of the people who lived in the neighborhoods that became redlined were poor white people because it was based on poverty and not so much race, the 1930s New Deal era measures taken by the Federal Housing Administration implemented redlining. And the purpose was to provide housing opportunities to middle and lower class white people. So the poor white people who lived in those neighborhoods were able to move out and into the suburbs. And that is how the inner city became the inner city. And this was perpetuated by measures like the GI Bill. So ultimately, it was about segregation and providing opportunities to middle and lower class white people that were not made available to black people. As an Asian American, I'm often asked, why do I focus so much on the advocacy work of black Americans? And it is because their advocacy work is always inclusive. The black civil rights movement did not just benefit black people, it benefited all marginalized people, and it is the reason why I, as an Asian American, have civil rights. Also, throughout Asian American history, black Americans have consistently held space for including us in their advocacy work. From the increase in anti-Asian violence in 2020 and 2021, to looking out for Japanese Americans during World War II. Going all the way back to 1869 when Frederick Douglass delivered a speech arguing that Chinese should be allowed to immigrate and become citizens. He didn't only want to advocate for the United States becoming a home for black and brown people, he said, I want the Asiatic to find a home here in the United States and feel at home here, both for his sake and for ours. Right wrongs, no man. The voice of civilization speaks an unmistakable language against the isolation of families, nations, and races, and pleads for composite nationality as essential to her triumphs. Man is man the world over. This fact is affirmed and admitted in any effort to deny it. The sentiments we exhibit, whether love or hate, confidence or fear, respect or contempt, will always imply a like humanity. If our action shall be in accordance with the principles of justice, liberty, and perfect human equality, no eloquence can adequately portray the greatness and grandeur of the future. My granduncle, who was nicknamed Uncle Abin, was actually named Abraham Lincoln because my great-granduncle was raised in the United States and he respected President Lincoln, whom he had been taught abolished slavery. Of course, he didn't stay in the United States because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, but I have to wonder if he had known about Frederick Douglass's speech, would I instead have had an Uncle Fred? The reason why I, as an Asian American, focus so much on the advocacy work of Black Americans is because theirs is the work that I would like to model mine after. You're obviously not aware of this, but blessed is not a word that the global majority thinks of in association with Europeans. Words like plague and colonizer, maybe, but not blessed. And the cell phone in my hand came from China. So I don't know if you're referencing Steve Jobs or Martin Cooper or the Finnish inventor who created the first pocket-sized telecommunication device in 1917, and you probably don't know either because your education system has left you terribly ignorant and without the critical thinking skills necessary to effectively gather information. Because you believe that most great inventions can be attributed to one white person, as opposed to recognizing that the patent system is how white people colonize intellectual property. We would not have cell phones if it wasn't for the creation of the gamma electrical cell by Black inventor Henry T. Sampson. And most of our cell phones would not have microphones in them if it wasn't for the particular microphone that was created by Black inventor James Edward West. The creation of the first digital network, 1G, was launched in Japan, and then Black electrical engineer Jesse Russell pioneered the creation of 2G, which launched in Finland first. 3G launched in Japan, 4G launched in Norway, 5G launched in South Korea, and 30% of the world's cell phones are manufactured in China. Because we, of the global majority, recognize that collective humanity has the ingenuity and creativity of one another to thank, whereas a lot of European Americans are laboring under the delusion that the rest of us have white people to thank. And it's this narcissistic ignorance that causes people like you to do embarrassing things, like leaving comments about Europeans and cell phones on a video about systemic anti-Black racism in the United States. And while that could be written off as a comedic and senile non sequitur, we recognize it as a desperate attempt to center yourself in a conversation that has nothing to do with you. The irony being that white people like to say not all white people and they shouldn't be held accountable for the misdeeds of their ancestors, yet they want to be associated with the greatness of the things that they think they invented.
You're taught in school that slavery ended in the Civil War. It did for about 10 years. By 1877, there was a compact made by North and South that the South could do what it felt like, essentially. So they reinstituted slavery, but they reinstituted it in a much more brutal form. What they did is criminalize black life. So if a black man is standing on a street corner, he can be arrested for vagrancy. If he looks at a white woman, he can be arrested for attempted rape, or something. And it didn't matter if you were in for a $10 fee, you'd never get out because you couldn't pay the corrupt judge and you couldn't pay the lawyer and you didn't have any money anyway. So it was essentially permanent servitude. These criminalized blacks were then handed over to industry. And that's a large part of American industrial development. There was big Southern industrialization based on mines, steel, U.S. Steel, and so on. A lot of it's just based on agriculture, of course. They went right back to the cotton fields. And this is a large part of American economic history. That's based, and it was worse than slavery for exactly the reasons that the slave owners had always argued. When we own these guys, we take care of them. When we just pick them up from the jails, we don't give a damn about them. If they die of starvation, fine, we'll get more from the jails. So you had a period worse than slavery. It went up to the Second World War. It was not small. Big impact on American industrial history.
And especially the African-American experience. It's literally not duplicated anywhere on earth in history. African Americans are a completely unique phenomenon as a people. Who they are culturally, what their history is, what their experience is, isn't duplicated anywhere on earth. You don't know where you came from. You don't know what country you came from. You don't know what culture you came from. You don't know what language you came from. You don't know what your religion was before. You, like I've said before, you're more American than anyone because you don't have any other identity. Actually, your entire identity is American-based. That's not the case of anyone else. I'm Irish American, I'm German American, I'm Italian American, I'm Jewish American, I'm this or that, the other. You can say African American, but you don't know anything about Africa. You don't even know which part of Africa. Africans don't call themselves that because I know my tribe. I have my language. I have my region, my country, my whatever. Like me saying European American. I'm not European. I'm specifically Irish and German. But you can't say that. You are American. You're the original Americans. You know, everyone else is immigrants. You can't even be called immigrants. Yeah. You know, you're originally American, and your culture is as close to being the indigenous culture of America as there can be without you being the indigenous people. You know, you're the indigenous people of the entity called America, called the United States of America. Everything else came from elsewhere. Your culture is the only one that came from right there because you were cut off from everything else. You know, there's nobody else like that. There's nobody else like that in the world. There's no other culture like that in the world. I don't know if you can think of a people who were more held back, more deprived, more sabotaged than African Americans. You took everything away from them and took them away from everything. They started in your country at less than zero. Literally regarded and treated as subhuman, not allowed to learn to read or write or anything for hundreds of years. But you see, they come from a people of accomplishment to one degree or another, not a people of piracy and theft and appropriation. They come from a people who created and built and developed in their own land. And even though you did everything that you could possibly do to suppress them, to hold them down, to hold them back, and you're still doing that until today, nevertheless, I don't think anyone can dispute the fact that African Americans have become a global cultural superpower. Culturally, they're a superpower. Whatever cultural soft power that America has in the global South, it's African American.
Colonial history, the legacy of enslavement, racial subordination and segregation, racial terrorism and racial inequality in the US remains a serious challenge as there has been no real commitment to reparation and to truth and reconciliation for people of African descent. Despite substantial changes since the end of the enforcement of Jim Crow and the fight for civil rights, ideology ensuring the domination of one group over another continues to negatively impact the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of African Americans today. The dangerous ideology of white supremacy inhibits social cohesion among the US population. Lynching was a form of racial terrorism that has contributed to a legacy of racial inequality that the US must address. Thousands of people of African descent were killed in violent public acts of racial control and domination, and the perpetrators were never held accountable. Contemporary police killings and the trauma it creates are reminiscent of the racial terror lynching of the past. Impunity for state violence has resulted in the current human rights crisis and must be addressed as a matter of urgency. Racial bias and disparities in the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, and the thought on crimes policy has disproportionately impacted African Americans. Mandatory minimum sentencing, disproportionate punishment of African Americans, including the death penalty, are of grave concern. The persistent gap in almost all the human development indicators, such as life expectancy, income and wealth, level of education, and even food security among African Americans and the rest of the US population reflect the level of structural discrimination that create de facto barriers for people of African descent to fully exercise their human rights. There is a profound need to acknowledge that the transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity, and among the major sources and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and that Africans and people of African descent were victims of this act, continue to be victims of their consequences. Past injustice and crimes against African Americans need to be addressed with reparatory justice. The working group urges Congress to expedite the passing of all pending criminal justice reform bills, including the End Racial Profiling Act, the Second Chance Reauthorization Act, and welcomes the bipartisan support for the Sentencing Reform and Correction Act, with, among other things, proposed to drastically reduce the use of mandatory minimum sentencing. The working group recommends to the government to allow independent monitoring of places of detention in the United States.